Golda Meir, who would later become known as Golda Meir, was born on May 3, 1898, in Kyiv, the capital of modern-day Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. Her father, Moshe Mabovich, was the son of a soldier in the Russian army. He received an education at a well-regarded religious school in Slonim, located in what is now western Belarus, before training as a carpenter. Her mother, Blum Nidich, was also from the region, and the couple would go on to have 8 children, though only 3 survived to adulthood: Shana, Golda, and Sipke, later known as Clara. Golda, the middle child, was born in 1898, 9 years after her eldest sister Shana, who was born in 1889, and 4 years before her younger sister Sipke, who arrived in 1902. The family, devoutly Jewish and part of the Pale of Settlement, lived in Pinsk. This region had been established as a restrictive zone for Jews within the Russian Empire since the late 18th century, severely limiting their rights and freedoms. After Sipke's birth, responsibility for Golda's care largely fell to Shana, who was just 12 years old at the time. Golda's early life was shaped by poverty and hardship. She grew up in a household dominated by 3 generations of strong-willed women: her grandmother, mother, and older sister. These women had a profound impact on her worldview and resilience. In early 1903, Moshe Mabovich moved the family to Pinsk, where Golda lived with her Nidich grandparents. That same year, a wave of anti-Jewish violence, or pogroms, began sweeping across the region, starting with the Kishinev pogrom in Moldova. Rumors of an impending attack in Pinsk led to widespread fear. Golda's father took precautionary measures, boarding up the family's home to protect him from potential attackers. Meanwhile, Shana armed herself with a kitchen knife. While no pogrom occurred in Pinsk, the fear and tension left an indelible mark on 5-year-old Golda. Following these events, Moshe decided to emigrate to the United States, joining many Russian Jews fleeing persecution and seeking better opportunities. He traveled alone initially, hoping to secure work and save enough money to bring his family over later. During his absence, Shana became increasingly involved in political discussions with local students. They debated potential solutions to the pervasive anti-Semitism and discrimination they faced, gravitating towards socialism and Zionism. These ideological debates and Shana's political involvement deeply influenced Golda during her formative years. In 1906, Moshe, now going by Morris, had saved enough to send for his family. Golda, her mother, and her sisters made the arduous journey to join him. Using forged documents, they traveled through Vienna and Antwerp before boarding a ship to Quebec, Canada. From there, they took a train to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where they were reunited with Moshe. Life in Milwaukee marked a significant change for the family. Bloom opened a grocery store with Shana's help to support the household, while Golda attended the 4th Street School, which has since been renamed in her honor. Golda thrived in school, excelling academically and becoming involved in community initiatives. She co-founded a society dedicated to helping underprivileged classmates. At home, the family's modest residence became a hub for local members of Pol Zion, a labor Zionist organization. Golda joined their ranks at the age of 14, solidifying her lifelong commitment to Zionist and socialist ideals. Although her parents envisioned a traditional future for her, including marriage and domesticity, Golda was determined to pursue her education. Encouraged by Shana, she defied her parents' wishes and attended high school in Milwaukee. Her time there was short-lived, however, as she moved to Denver, Colorado, to live with Shana and her husband. During her stay in Denver, Golda was exposed to a dynamic intellectual environment. Her sister's home hosted frequent gatherings where socialism, Zionism, literature, and women's rights were passionately discussed. These experiences deepened Golda's political convictions and aspirations. Returning to Milwaukee, Golda completed high school in 1916. She became increasingly active in Zionist causes, dedicating herself to the dream of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Her determination to immigrate to Palestine eventually led to her marriage to Morris Meyerson in 1917. Golda's unwavering commitment to her goals played a decisive role in their relationship, as she made it clear she would only marry Morris if he agreed to emigrate with her. Despite initial delays caused by World War I, the couple finally fulfilled their dream, arriving in Palestine in 1921. Golda and Morris initially settled in Tel Aviv before joining Kibbutz Mohavia in the Jezreel Valley. Life on the kibbutz was physically demanding but fulfilling for Golda, who embraced the communal lifestyle and quickly earned respect within the community. Her leadership abilities began to shine, and she took on various responsibilities, from tending to the fields to managing financial affairs. Her dedication and natural leadership did not go unnoticed, and she became increasingly involved in the broader Zionist movement. In late 1921, Golda represented Mohavia at a kibbutz movement gathering, where she was surrounded by influential political figures. Among them were David Ben-Gurion, the Secretary General of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor, and leader of the Ahadat HaAvoda, Unity of Labor, Party. Also present were Berl Katznelson, a key intellectual in the labor Zionist movement, and Levi Eshkol, leader of the Degania Bet Kibbutz. During her speech at the conference, Golda faced criticism for addressing the attendees in her native Yiddish instead of Hebrew. Upon returning to Mohavia, she discovered that her husband Morris was battling depression and malaria. Despite his condition, Golda remained dedicated to her political responsibilities and was soon chosen to represent her kibbutz at the Women Workers' Council. In 1923, as the council's delegate to the Second Histadrut Conference, Golda argued that women should be integrated into the leadership of the Histadrut rather than forming a separate women's council. This proposal caught the attention of leaders like Ben-Gurion and Katznelson. By 1924, Morris grew disillusioned with kibbutz life, prompting the couple to relocate to Tel Aviv and later to Jerusalem. While Morris appreciated Jerusalem's rich history and culture, Golda maintained her focus on the Zionist political scene in Tel Aviv. On November 23, 1924, Golda gave birth to a son, Menahem, named after her maternal grandfather. The following year, she briefly returned to Mohavia with her infant son. However, when the kibbutz members assigned her to nanny duties instead of agricultural work, she returned to Jerusalem. In May 1926, after the birth of her daughter Sarah, Golda took a teaching position at a private school to support her family. That same year, her parents moved to Palestine and settled in Herzliya, north of Tel Aviv. Despite frequent visits to her parents and sister, Golda grew increasingly unhappy in her personal life and became distant from Morris. Rumors began to circulate about her romantic involvement with other men, including David Remez, head of Solol Bonnet and a protégé of Berl Katznelson. In 1927, Remez offered her the position of Secretary General of the Women's Workers' Council to bolster the Histadrut's influence within the organization. Golda accepted the role and moved back to Tel Aviv with her 2 children, leaving Morris behind in Jerusalem. Golda used her role in the Women's Council to actively participate in Histadrut debates, which played a crucial role in establishing the foundation for the future Jewish state. Her growing influence led to her being sent to the United States to raise funds for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Her American background made her popular among audiences, and she was later tasked with building support in Britain and France among socialist organizations. Upon returning to Palestine, Golda witnessed the formation of MAPI, the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, through the unification of the country's 2 major socialist factions. In 1932, she traveled to the United States seeking treatment for her daughter Sarah's kidney condition and to revitalize the labor Zionist movement. Over the next 2 years, Golda tirelessly toured North America, championing the Zionist cause and portraying the efforts of Jewish pioneers in Palestine in biblical terms. When she returned to Palestine in 1934, Golda was appointed to the Histadrut's Executive Council, where she oversaw the tourism sector. Despite Ben-Gurion's success in increasing Jewish immigration, particularly to Tel Aviv, which had grown to a population of 150,000. These influxes sparked riots among the Arab population. In response, British authorities imposed immigration quotas, which were seen as excessively high by the Arabs and too restrictive by the Jews. During this time, Palestine continued receiving Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. While Golda continued her international efforts as the Histadrut's representative, part of her work included assisting Jewish immigrants in finding housing and employment through the Jewish Agency, which acted as the de facto Jewish government in Palestine. When political violence erupted between Arabs and Jews in 1936, the British government sent Lord William Peel to chair a commission of inquiry aimed at resolving the Palestine issue. After meeting with Arab and Jewish leaders, the Peel Commission concluded that partitioning Palestine was the best solution, establishing a newly independent Jewish state while annexing much of the land to the Arab Kingdom of Transjordan to the east. While David Ben-Gurion welcomed the idea of an independent Jewish state, Golda Meir strongly opposed the Peel Commission's partition plan, which allocated only a quarter of historical Palestine to the Jews. At the 20th Zionist Congress held in Zurich in 1937, Golda rallied support from right-wing Zionists who rejected concessions to Arabs, as well as Jewish socialists who advocated for a united Palestine with Arabs and Jews living together. The Congress endorsed Golda's position, and the Second British Commission in 1938 rejected the partition proposals. Meanwhile, the situation for European Jews worsened following Hitler's annexation of Austria and threats to incorporate Czechoslovakia into the Nazis' Third Reich in 1938. Golda pleaded with British officials to increase the restricted immigration quota, cut to just over 10,000 in 1937, and served as an operative for the Mossad Aliyah Bet, a secret network smuggling Jews out of Nazi-occupied Europe. In the summer of 1938, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt convened the Evian Conference, bringing together representatives from 32 nations to discuss the plight of European Jews. As an observer representing the Jews of Palestine, Golda was outraged by the expressions of sympathy without any substantial action toward accepting refugees. In May 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain unveiled a final plan for Palestine, confining the Jewish population to just 5% of the land and restricting migration to 75,000 over the next 5 years. An independent Palestinian state was to be established, governed jointly by Arabs and Jews. The Jews in Palestine felt betrayed, and Golda, alongside Ben-Gurion and other leaders, led nearly 200,000 Jews in a general strike. At the same time, Jewish communities prepared for war against both the British and Arabs, establishing settlements throughout the country. At the 21st Zionist Congress in Vienna in August 1939, as plans for Jewish resistance were solidifying, Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. On September 1, Hitler invaded Poland, a country with 4 million Jews, sparking the outbreak of the Second World War after Britain and France declared war on Germany. Golda, like many Jewish leaders, faced the difficult position of encouraging Jews to join the British Army while secretly smuggling refugees into Palestine. As one of the senior leaders of the Jewish community, she served on the British War Economic Advisory Council, helping to enforce wartime rationing among Jews, and led the Histadrut's political department, resolving labor disputes. While the British sought to crack down on Jewish immigration into Palestine, Nazi forces continued to advance across Europe, occupying large parts of Belarus and Ukraine. By 1942, German and Italian forces threatened to invade Egypt and Palestine. When rumors reached Palestine that the Nazis were exterminating Polish Jews in gas chambers, Golda believed them and worked to raise funds for those under Nazi occupation. Following the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, she offered the Haganah's support to British secret agents working behind enemy lines. After General Bernard Montgomery's victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, Palestine was no longer at risk of German invasion, though the war in Europe continued until May 1945 with the Nazi surrender. Following the liberation of over 600,000 Jews from concentration camps, Golda and her colleagues sought to find a new home for them in Palestine. Zionists were buoyed by the British Labour Party's victory in July 1945, as the party consistently supported a Jewish state in Palestine. However, when Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin sought to uphold conservative policies, the Jews felt betrayed again. Golda endorsed violent resistance, leading to a civil war between Jewish fighters and British authorities. The US was more sympathetic to the Zionists, and in early 1946, the British agreed to form an Anglo-American commission. On March 25, Golda addressed the commission, describing the persecution and terror Jews faced in Europe and advocating for an independent Jewish homeland. The commission recommended 100,000 visas for Jews, but the British refused, intensifying the conflict. After the British crackdown on the Jewish agency leadership, Golda became head of its political department in June 1946. While she struggled to balance her opposition to terrorism and her determination to resist British rule, in February 1947, the Attlee government referred the Palestine question to the United Nations. In September, the UN Special Committee on Palestine proposed partition, with Jerusalem under international jurisdiction. The Zionists accepted these proposals, though most Arab neighbors rejected them. When King Abdullah of Transjordan proposed secret negotiations with Palestinian Jews, Golda was appointed as a female envoy. Abdullah was surprised by Golda's stance, as he hoped to annex Arab Palestine, but Golda supported Jewish statehood. In late November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution endorsing partition, with Golda holding the fort in Jerusalem while her colleagues advocated for it in New York. Following Arab attacks on Jewish settlements, Golda took charge of Jerusalem's defense, exposing herself to danger while crossing Arab-held territories. In January 1948, she returned to the US to lead a fundraising campaign for the Haganah, raising over $50 million by February. In March, she returned to Jerusalem, where she helped Ben-Gurion break the siege of the city. Although disappointed not to be appointed to Israel's new administration, Golda met King Abdullah again in Amman in May 1948. She rejected his suggestion of waiting for full independence, and on May 14, 1948, Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Among those signing the Declaration of Independence was Golda Meir, who had been in Palestine for 27 years, gradually rising to leadership alongside Ben-Gurion. After raising another $75 million for Israel, Golda was appointed Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1949. While the Soviet Union supported Israel, their backing was primarily motivated by a desire to expel the British from the Middle East. Golda struggled to gain support from the Soviet Union and faced increasing crackdowns on Jews in the Soviet Union. In January 1949, she marked Rosh Hashanah at Moscow's synagogue, where thousands of Jews acclaimed her, demonstrating support for Israel. By February 1949, Golda returned to Israel to serve as Minister of Labor, responsible for housing and employment for the arriving Jewish refugees. In the Knesset, she announced plans to build 30,000 new homes. Despite requests for funding for the Israeli military and social welfare, American Jews agreed to support the construction project by purchasing bonds that were guaranteed by the Israeli government. Upon her return to Israel, she suggested an ambitious infrastructure construction initiative to address the unemployment issue, which included restoring roads that had been damaged during the recent conflict. In 1950, she went back to America in search of $15 billion over the next 15 years through government bonds. Once home, she continued to promote Jewish immigration to Israel despite the strains placed on the current state infrastructure. While she worked to advance the Israeli economy, in May 1951, Golda learned that her husband Morris had passed away from a heart attack. Weeks later, her political mentor and trusted advisor, David Remez, also died. Putting these personal hardships aside, Golda dedicated herself to working 19 hours each day to establish a social democratic nation in Israel. In January 1952, she introduced a national insurance program to offer financial assistance to women, children, and the elderly. In spite of opposition from Finance Minister Levi Eshkol, the Minister of Labour succeeded in the proposal. In 1953, she managed to pass a law instituting national service for women in hospitals and schools, although it angered the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. In 1955, when Golda was invited by Ben-Gurion to run as the Mapai candidate for mayor of Tel Aviv, she lost after 2 conservative Orthodox representatives voted for the incumbent. Even though a ceasefire mediated by the United Nations had been in effect since July 1949, Arab insurgents, or Fedayeen, continued to carry out attacks on Israeli territory. Feeling exasperated by the ongoing incursions, in October 1953, Moshe Dayan, the aggressive chief of operations of the Israeli Defense Forces, dispatched a group of elite troops led by Ariel Sharon to mount a retaliatory strike on the Fedayeen stronghold of Kibbutz in Jordan, resulting in the deaths of 69 civilians. The event led to a series of conflicts between Ben-Gurion and his foreign minister Moshe Sharet, who condemned the excessive use of force by the Israeli Defense Forces. Throughout the power struggle, Ben-Gurion stepped down from the premiership in January 1954 and was succeeded by Sharet, but by late 1955, Ben-Gurion had returned to the position and aimed to strengthen his power. In June 1956, shortly after adopting the Hebrew surname Meir, Golda succeeded Sharet as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, representing Israel on the global stage. In July 1956, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal, posing a threat to British and French economic interests. When the British and French extended an invitation to Israel to participate in a scheme to militarily take control of the canal, Ben-Gurion eagerly accepted the opportunity, harboring resentment towards Nasser for blocking the canal to Israeli shipping and allowing Palestinian Fedayeen to launch attacks on Israel from Egyptian territory. While Meir participated in the discussions, Moshe Dayan and Shimon Peres from the Ministry of Defense conducted much of the dialogue. The 3 parties formulated a strategy for Israel to invade Egypt, while Britain and France would intervene under the guise of acting as peacekeepers while achieving their genuine motives for taking control of the canal. The operation commenced on 29 October 1956, and in just 4 days, Israeli forces captured the Gaza Strip and all of the Sinai Peninsula, located to the east of the canal. Despite suffering severe losses, Nasser made the canal impassable by sinking vessels and garnered international sympathy, while both the Soviets and the Americans urged Israeli troops to pull back at the United Nations. At the UN, Foreign Minister Golda Meir represented Israel, contending that the Israeli presence in the Sinai Peninsula was a defensive measure after the Fedayeen consistently assaulted Israel from bases in Egypt. Under diplomatic pressure from the United States, Ben-Gurion consented to withdraw from the Sinai in exchange for American acknowledgement of Israel's right to respond to further Fedayeen assaults originating from Egypt. Meir reluctantly delivered a speech at the UN to this effect but felt let down when the Americans did not recognize Israel's right to respond. Following the Suez crisis, Meir and Ben-Gurion also found themselves at odds regarding their approach to West Germany. While Ben-Gurion pursued economic and military assistance from the Germans, Meir was cautious about engaging a government that still employed numerous former Nazi officials. Over time, as Germany evolved into Israel's second-largest supplier of arms, Meir eventually backed Ben-Gurion's strategy of fostering closer relations with Germany to the point that in 1965, she accepted the appointment of former Nazi officer Ralph Friedman Pauls as German ambassador to Israel. In May 1960, Israel's National Security Agency, Mossad, captured the prominent Nazi official Adolf Eichmann from Argentina, where he had escaped in 1945 after being convicted of war crimes. When Argentina raised concerns with the UN that Israel had breached its sovereignty, Meir provided a robust defense of Israeli actions, claiming that the unlawful incursion was warranted to bring those responsible for the Holocaust to justice. The UN supported her argument, and Eichmann was put on trial and executed in Israel in June 1962. Meir devoted a significant part of her time as foreign minister to fostering connections with newly independent nations in sub-Saharan Africa. Although Meir regarded black Africans as natural partners in the battle against colonialism and ethnic discrimination, the African nations were appreciative of the chance to obtain economic aid from a nation that had not participated in dividing the continent. Meir assisted President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana in setting up a state shipping business. Israeli construction firms oversaw a public works initiative in Nigeria, and after the Belgians departed the Congo in 1962, she sent Israeli army doctors to help with the lack of medical professionals. While Ben-Gurion was doubtful about his foreign minister's efforts in Africa, Meir defended her initiatives as a way to diminish Arab influence in the area. Meir's focus on Africa was further motivated by a belief that Ben-Gurion perceived diplomacy mainly as a tool for acquiring weapons and depended on officials in the defense ministry, which he managed, to steer his relationships with the world's prominent powers. Not only did Meir view individuals like Dayan and Peres as unnecessarily aggressive, but she also worried that they would stray from the prevailing labor Zionist principles. When Ben-Gurion tried to promote Dayan and Peres to the cabinet in the late 1950s, Meir opposed alongside two seasoned Mapai leaders, Education Minister Zalman Aran and Trade Minister Pinhas Sapir. A lengthy and complicated contention arose between Ben-Gurion and the older guard led by Meir during the early part of the 1960s. Ben-Gurion aimed to initiate a public inquiry regarding the actions of Pinhas Lavin, who was defense minister from 1954 to 1955. Lavin had faced allegations of approving a false flag operation to bomb numerous civilian sites in Egypt, but he denied any awareness and claimed Peres was the person at fault. After being compelled to resign, Lavin sought to vindicate his reputation. When Ben-Gurion suggested a comprehensive judicial inquiry, Meir and the majority of the Mapai leaders objected, appalled at the idea of a leadership conflict unfolding in public. Ben-Gurion stepped down from the premiership in June 1963 and was succeeded by Levi Eshkol, but continued to demand a public probe into the Lavin affair, criticizing his successor in the process. Even though she was in her mid-60s and had recently received a lymphoma diagnosis, Meir spearheaded the effort to obstruct Ben-Gurion from staging a political return. When a terminally ill Moshe Sharet criticized Ben-Gurion for undermining national unity in the Knesset in February 1965, Meir leaned forward and kissed him before launching her own attack on the former prime minister. Ben-Gurion retaliated by establishing a new party, Rafi, which secured 10 seats in the Knesset elections in November. In the meantime, Meir had forged an alliance with the pro-Soviet version of Ardat Ha-Avoda, which had broken away from Mapai in 1944, which garnered a total of 45 seats, driving the final nail into Ben-Gurion's political coffin. After her political triumph, Meir resigned as foreign minister in January 1966 and announced her plan to retire due to health issues. She maintained significant political influence, and within weeks, was invited to take on the role of Secretary General of Mapai, a position she accepted to pursue the unification of the moderate socialist parties into one unified Labour Party. While Eshkol held the title of Prime Minister, Meir was the most powerful political figure in the nation. As the Israeli government worked to recover from the harsh political conflicts of the previous decade, tensions were rising along the Egyptian-Israeli border. On the 16th of May 1967, in reaction to inaccurate Soviet intelligence suggesting an impending Israeli attack, NASA demanded the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping force stationed on the Egyptian-Israeli border since the Suez crisis, intending to replace them with Egyptian troops. Eshkol's government faced challenges in handling the crisis, while conservative opposition leader Menahem Begin allied with Dayan, demanding that Ben-Gurion lead a government of national unity. Eshkol and Meir opposed these efforts but had to consent to a national unity government with Dayan serving as Minister of Defense. On the morning of the 5th of June, Dayan instructed the Israeli Air Force to take action, and within a few hours, over 300 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over the span of 6 days, Israeli forces regained control of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula and captured the Golan Heights from Syria, Egypt's ally, while East Jerusalem and the West Bank were taken from Jordan. This time, the Israelis were resolute in their refusal to heed UN calls to withdraw their occupation forces. Back in Israel, Meir persisted in her efforts to unite the moderate left, leading to the formation of the Israeli Labour Party in January 1968 after the merger of Mapai, Rafi, and Ardut. After serving as the inaugural General Secretary of the United Party, Meir resigned in August 1968, seemingly determined to retire permanently. To thwart Dayan's aspirations to become Eshkol's successor, Meir appointed former Ardut leader Yigal Allon as Eshkol's deputy prime minister. With Allon and Dayan disputing in the background over the West Bank, Eshkol suffered a heart attack in late 1968 and passed away at the end of February 1969. Understanding that appointing either Allon or Dayan as prime minister could lead to a division in the party, Labour Secretary General Pinhas Sapir invited Meir to take on the role of new prime minister. Acknowledging her declining health, she agreed only after being assured by her doctor that she had another decade to live. Although Dayan and Allon enjoyed significantly greater popularity among the populace, on March 7, the Labour Party's Central Committee voted unanimously in support of Meir, who officially took office on the 17th. Just 2 months shy of her 71st birthday, the woman who had been Ben-Gurion's close confidant in the 1950s before orchestrating his political decline in the 1960s had become the first female head of government in the Western world. In 1968, following the embarrassing loss in the Six-Day War, Nasser initiated the War of Attrition by launching missiles from the western bank of the Suez Canal into Israeli-occupied Sinai. As Prime Minister, Meir inherited Eshkol's coalition, which encompassed the entire political spectrum and led to political stalemate. Due to her humility and pragmatic approach, by July, her approval rating surged to 90%, and in October 1969, she directed an alliance of Labour and the left-wing Mapam Party, which secured 56 seats in the Knesset. Despite her socialist inclinations, she found it challenging to navigate the labor conflicts that plagued the nation. While the Israeli economy was projected to grow by 35% from 1969 to 1973, workers' wages did not keep pace with inflation, and all labor unions in the nation were managed by the state through Histadrut. Meir was reluctant to allow Histadrut any level of autonomy from the state, and the Labour Federation disintegrated within 10 years. Her loyalty to socialist ideals of collectivism eroded her backing among the younger liberal individualist segment of society. In March 1971, Meir encountered a public uprising in Jerusalem led by the Black Panthers, a group named after the American civil rights organization, to protest against discrimination faced by Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, who lived at a lesser standard than those of Eastern European descent. The Panthers were frustrated by the fact that the Israeli administration was predominantly comprised of Eastern European Jews, and Meir had previously remarked that Jews who did not speak Yiddish were not authentic Jews. While suppressing the Panthers, Meir sought to defend Eastern European Jews by asserting that they had endured greater hardship and discrimination than other Jews and charged the Panthers with being unpatriotic. The protests persisted throughout the summer, during which the Panthers demanded Meir's resignation and burned her effigy. Despite her earlier opposition to Ben-Gurion on the same topic, Meir now maintained that defense expenditure was crucial and the government could not afford advancements in social welfare. Regardless of the Israeli military's success record, Meir was concerned about Israel's ongoing survival, particularly after the Palestinian Liberation Organization's leader Yasser Arafat, who had taken over from the ailing Nasser as the leader of the Arab cause in 1970, declared that the Arabs aimed for the destruction of the State of Israel. Although Meir sought to negotiate a diplomatic resolution with her Arab neighbors, they refused to engage in discussions unless the Israelis first withdrew to their pre-1967 boundaries. Naturally, Meir was unwilling to relinquish her bargaining advantages even before talks had commenced. Disenchanted by the UN peace process, the Americans and Soviets worked to formulate a solution for the Middle East. Neither superpower desired for the Cold War to escalate, and US President Richard Nixon was eager to enhance relations with the Soviets. Meir perceived that these peace initiatives would not yield significant results as long as the Arabs remained resolved to eliminate Israel from the global map. In December 1969, Nixon's Secretary of State William Rogers revealed a peace plan based on Israeli withdrawal from all occupied territories in exchange for an Egyptian assurance of non-belligerency. Meir opposed Rogers' ambiguous proposals and directed her ambassador to Washington, Yitzhak Rabin, to rally the American Jewish lobby against it. The Israeli rejection was accompanied by bombing raids into the Egyptian interior, prompting the Soviets to boost their arms shipments to Egypt. By the end of July 1970, Meir hesitantly accepted Rogers' proposal for a 90-day ceasefire along with UN mediation, yet her confidence in the Americans was shaken when Israeli intelligence revealed that NASA had exploited the ceasefire to position a Soviet anti-aircraft missile system on the western bank of the Suez Canal. When urged to display more flexibility, accusing the Americans especially of compromising Jewish security for their diplomatic interests. As she took her resolute stance, she allied more closely with her defense minister and former adversary, Moshe Dayan. The Prime Minister admitted her lack of knowledge in military matters and depended on advice from the well-liked general, while the Defense Minister valued the political skills of Israel's matriarch. The passing of Nasser in September 1970 sparked expectations for a peace agreement with his successor, Anwar Sadat. While Sadat persisted in demanding Israeli withdrawal from all occupied territories, Meir proposed a partial retreat from the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Even though Sadat found the counteroffer unacceptable, Meir outlined a plan that would allow Israel to retain the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, and the Egyptian port of Sharm el-Sheikh, situated at the southern end of the Sinai, while Israeli forces would withdraw from the remainder of the peninsula. These proposals led Menahem Begin to initiate a vote of no confidence against her, which she narrowly overcame. Meir's strategies for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip lacked clarity, but she was willing to relinquish these lands to the Arabs, preferably to Jordan, as she believed Israel's security was best maintained with a Jewish majority state rather than absorbing more than 1 million Arabs from the occupied regions. Reluctant to disturb the fragile political equilibrium within the nation before the Arabs were serious about negotiations, Meir upheld the status quo, allowing Dayan and the Ministry of Defense to manage the West Bank. Dayan supported the unconventional idea of establishing a permanent Israeli military presence in the West Bank while permitting the Arab regions to be governed by Jordan. Despite opposition from most of his government peers, Dayan anticipated that coexistence would foster peace and began to execute his vision, constructing Jewish settlements in the West Bank and promoting the flow of goods and people between Israel and Jordan. Even though the Jordanians participated in the 1967 conflict alongside the Egyptians, they remained Israel's closest ally among the Arab nations. Israelis acknowledged that King Hussein faced significant pressure to exhibit pan-Arab unity from compatriots and his own Palestinian constituents. Hussein also wanted to escape the fate of his grandfather, King Abdullah, whom Meir had encountered just before Israeli independence and who was assassinated by a Palestinian in 1951. On September 6, 1970, Palestinian Fedayeen seized 4 commercial aircraft and landed them at Dawson's Field, a Jordanian airbase, demanding the release of Fedayeen prisoners. After freeing most of the hostages, the Palestinians retained the Jewish prisoners and destroyed the vacant aircraft on September 12. Jordan plunged into civil war on September 17, when Hussein commanded loyal troops to subdue the Fedayeen in his capital of Amman, prompting Syrian intervention in support of the Palestinians. Upon receiving a cry for assistance from Hussein, Meir instructed the Israeli Air Force to fly over the Syrian troops as a show of strength, which combined with a successful Jordanian counteroffensive, halted the Syrian advance. Days before his death, Nasser facilitated a tentative peace agreement between Jordan and Palestine. As the impasse in the Middle East persisted, numerous entities offered to mediate a peace agreement, including a delegation of African leaders. Meir had lost faith in any significant peace with the Arabs, a sentiment that was reinforced on the morning of September 5, 1972, when the Palestinian Fedayeen group Black September abducted 11 Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics. With 2 Israelis already dead, the Fedayeen threatened to execute the rest unless Israel released more than 200 Arab prisoners. The incident marked the most recent in a series of terrorist assaults against Israeli targets authorized by Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. When the Fedayeen declined to accept a ransom payment from the West German authorities, German police initiated a failed rescue operation, which led to the deaths of all the Israelis, 1 German police officer and 5 Fedayeen. In response, on September 15 Meir authorized Mossad to carry out an operation to track down the Fedayeen responsible for Munich. When Meir faced criticism for denying the Palestinians their right to their own nation, she refused to recognize the existence of a distinct Palestinian nation and contended that Palestinian Arabs were free to reside in any of the Arab nations in the Middle East. In May 1973, after 4 years at the helm of the country, Meir declared her intention to step down from the premiership in October. Her approval ratings remained over 70%, the economy was experiencing rapid growth, and Israel was receiving substantial military assistance from the US government, which made her feel increasingly secure. While Meir shifted her focus from defense to social policy, in August the Syrians set up Soviet anti-aircraft batteries opposite the Golan Heights. On September 25, King Hussein covertly visited Israel to alert them of a looming Syrian attack backed by Egypt. Despite Israeli intelligence reports indicating that Egyptian troops were moving towards the Suez Canal, Dayan believed the Egyptians would not have the courage to confront the Israeli military. On October 5, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, General David Elazar, suspected that hostilities were on the horizon, but the Israeli leadership refrained from full-scale mobilization. On the morning of October 6, the day of Yom Kippur, the most significant holiday on the Jewish religious calendar, Meir met with Elazar and Dayan. Although she opted against launching a preemptive airstrike that could threaten American diplomatic support, she consented to full mobilization over Dayan's objections. The invasion commenced that afternoon, but the Israeli leadership was confident that they would replicate their earlier successes against the Arabs. They were taken aback to receive reports of Egyptians conducting coordinated attacks on Israeli targets along the canal in the south, while Syrian tanks advanced towards the Golan Heights. The Israeli air dominance that had secured the Six-Day War was undermined by the Egyptian and Syrian anti-aircraft defenses. While a frantic Dayan suggested relinquishing the Golan for a more defensible position, Elazar remained hopeful that he could withstand the enemy assaults long enough to mobilize his reserves. When a disheartened Dayan supplied his resignation, Meir refused, but she took private charge of the war effort, developing plans for a counteroffensive alongside her senior officials. As the Israeli reserves took to the field, the tide of war began to turn at the cost of heavy casualties. By the third day of the war, the Syrians were falling back in the north, while Elazar's costly counterattack in the south halted the Egyptian advance. After recapturing the Golan Heights, Meir authorized the Israeli Defense Force to advance on the Syrian capital of Damascus on October 11. On October 14, Israeli tanks defeated an Egyptian assault in the Sinai, allowing Israeli troops to cross the canal on the 15th. When the Soviets and Americans proposed a ceasefire and direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel, Meir was initially inclined to reject the terms, as the Israeli Defense Force was poised to surround and eliminate the Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai. After learning that Sadat had accepted the proposals, Meir met U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to finalize the details of a ceasefire on October 22. After an Egyptian attempt to break out of the encirclement, fighting resumed until a second ceasefire was agreed upon on October 25, with the Egyptian Third Army completely trapped. While the Israelis had managed to pull off a victory, 2,600 soldiers had perished in the process, and instead of celebrating, the Israeli people blamed the initial setbacks on Meir and Dayan. Though she accepted her responsibility for the debacle, Meir traveled to the United States to discuss peace proposals with Kissinger and President Nixon. In late-night discussions with Kissinger, Meir adamantly refused to break the encirclement of the Third Army without a prisoner exchange. In the meantime, on October 28, Egyptian and Israeli military officials made substantial progress in negotiating a prisoner exchange, the resupply of the Egyptian Third Army, the gradual withdrawal of troops from both sides, and the reopening of the Suez Canal. The agreement was finalized when Kissinger visited the Middle East the following week. As a result of the war, the Knesset elections scheduled for October 31 were postponed to December 31. Despite her previous commitment to resign, Meir hoped to keep the Labour Party united while denying power to Begin's Likud party. While Dayan had been blamed for the failure to prepare for the war, Meir kept her defense minister in his post, causing her own popularity to decline. On December 21, Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban attended the Middle East Peace Conference in Geneva alongside the Jordanian and Egyptian delegations, but the meeting lasted one day without being reconvened. When voters went to the polls on December 31, Meir's Labour Party won 40% of the vote against 29% for Likud. While Labour remained the largest party, Meir was disappointed to have lost support. As she tried to form a new government, Meir realized that whether she retained Dayan or sacked him, a faction of the Labour Party would refuse to back the government. On April 11, she resigned as party leader, throwing her support behind Yitzhak Rabin, who narrowly emerged as the party's choice. Meir retained the premiership until she was able to secure a disengagement agreement with Syria, brokered by Kissinger on May 31. On June 3, she left the Prime Minister's office and was succeeded by Rabin. At the age of 76, Golda Meir was a legend in her own lifetime. When her ghost-written autobiography was published in 1975, it became a global bestseller. On November 14, 1977, Meir attended the opening of Golda, a Broadway play by William Gibson. Days later, she returned to Israel to meet Anwar Sadat, who was visiting Israel after declaring his willingness to make peace. When Meir asked the Egyptian president why he could not have met her several years earlier, Sadat responded that the time was not right. Earlier in the year, Menachem Begin had become prime minister after defeating Labour in the Knesset elections in May. Meir was disheartened that the conservative Begin, who appointed the rehabilitated Dayan as his foreign minister, was taking the credit for making peace. In September 1978, Begin, Sadat, and US President Jimmy Carter negotiated the Camp David Accords, paving the way for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. While Begin and Sadat were in Oslo to receive the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize, Golda Meir died of lymphoma at the age of 80 on December 8, 1978. Golda Meir had lived an extraordinary life spanning 3 continents. After being born into poverty in the Russian Empire with the threat of pogroms hanging over her, she spent her childhood in the United States, where she became a passionate believer in the labor Zionist movement. After struggling to balance her life ambitions with her parents' demands, she prevailed upon her reluctant husband to move to Palestine, anticipating the establishment of a Jewish nation following the Balfour Declaration. After a challenging first decade in the kibbutz and struggling to make ends meet in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Meir began her slow climb up the ranks of Jewish political leadership, becoming an indispensable advocate for the Zionist movement in the United States, neglecting her children and leaving her husband in the process. After working tirelessly to support European Jews under Nazi occupation in the 1930s and 40s, Meir emerged as the right-hand woman of David Ben-Gurion, the father of the Nation of Israel, founded in 1948. What are your opinions on Golda Meir? Was she a powerful leader who proved to the world that women could confront men on the global political arena and secured the ongoing existence of the State of Israel? Or did she overlook several chances to establish peace with the Arabs due to her inflexibility and rigidity? Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.